Kia ora tātou, ko Sally Washington toko ingoa, kei anzog ahoe mahi ana, tēnā koutou katoa. So welcome everybody to this fourth and last webinar from the Australian New Zealand School of Government and the Centre for Public Impact on reimagining government. I always want to say reinventing government, but I think I'm just a little bit further ahead. So I'm Sally Washington, I'm NZOG's Director for Aotearoa New Zealand. And before we start, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, wherever we are in the world today, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, including the tangata whenua of Aotearoa New Zealand. So we've got a wonderful panel here for you today. It's going to be a really exciting conversation. So we'll go right into introducing them. So we have Lil Anderson, who's the Chief Executive of Te Arawhiti, the Office of Māori Crown Relations in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We have Toby Lowe, right on the other side of the world, who's Visiting Professor in Public Management at the Centre for Public Impact. Lynn Mumford, also in the UK, who's the Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships for the Mayday Trust. And Kim Peake, who's a partner at EY Port Jackson Partners, but probably most people will know her as the former Secretary of the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services. So before we get into the topic, this is just some housekeeping and technical things. So can you all please stay on mute with your videos off? This webinar is going to be recorded and published with automated captions, so just be aware of that. If you want to tweet, can you use the hashtag ReimagineGov, and please contribute your comments and questions to the chat just whenever you want to. Okay, so let's get into it. I think we could spend all day talking about definitions. So even what is a system? Is a system a service system? Is it the health system? Is it the justice system? Is it the whole of government system? Or is it a wider ecosystem that brings in all those different parts and has an interface with non-government actors? And then we could talk about stewardship and what that means all day, I think, as well. And at its most basic sense, it's about taking care of something with a temporal element that's taking care of something over time. But in what is system stewardship, it depends a lot on context and your perspective. And we've had an earlier conversation with the panelist today, and they all seem to have a fairly similar understanding of what system stewardship is, but they come from quite different perspectives. And I think that's what we want to bring out today and get to see what their different perspectives are. So let's go straight to the panel. Normally we would have a poll at this point, and the audience gets to choose the first question. But I think this definition one is so important that we're going to go right to the panel first. So their question is, what does system stewardship mean to you? And I want the panelists to think about what their perspective is and what would it look like if it was working well for them. And I think I'm going to go to Lil first, because Lil is actually a designated system leader in the New Zealand public management system, which is quite new and quite unusual. So Lil, tell us, what does system stewardship mean to you?
Tēnā koe, Sally, and tēnā tātou katoa. Look, I think there's, we were lucky enough here in New Zealand that our State Sector Act or State Services Act was rewritten in 2020, and that provides a definition of the role as a system leader who coordinates best practice in a particular subject matter across some or all of government. I myself, though, have adopted my own definition of what my role is. In New Zealand, we have a word called kaitiakitanga. It translates literally to guardianship. And so I have taken my role as a system leader of the Māori Crown relationship in its widest sense, that I am the guardian of the Māori Crown relationship insofar as it relates to the 36 public service agencies in Aotearoa. That means, in my view, I have a role to care and protect it. I have a role to grow and nurture it. I have a role for 60,000 public servants to grow their capability. I have a role in overall system design, as well as managing Māori Crown issues between agencies and Māori communities. I also set a lot of standards for capability here. We've designed a framework to help public servants to, I think, be accountable and I help people to reach those standards. All of those things, I think, encapsulate what I'd say my role is as a system leader, and I think it's in the spirit of the Act from 2020 as well. So I hope that gives some guidance, Sally, into how the Act, how the role is playing out, and I'm a year into it at the moment, so it seems to be working so far.
Like you've got it sorted, Lynn. Kia ora. Let's go to Lynn now, because Lynn, you're a provider, so you're at the interface with the government system, but you're in a system yourself and managing that system. What does system stewardship mean to you?
Yeah, thank you. So at Mayday Trust, we see system stewardship as something that really happens at the grassroots. So this is very much led by our, what we call a person-led transitional and strength-based coaches that work with people who are going through tough times, such as experiencing homelessness, coming out of prison or leaving the care system. And I think the system that they are kind of ultimately stewarding is the unique set of relationships and factors that are meaningful to the individual that's going through the tough times. So this could include family, friends, community, hobbies, interests, sometimes other services that might form part of their lives. And I think the focus of the PTS coach as system steward is on building trusting voluntary relationships that are led by the person they're working with. So the person brings what they feel is important. The coach ensures that choice and control is with the individual and not with them. And this allows for all interventions to be 100% uniquely led and tailored to each individual they work with. So really creating that environment so that they are deeply listening, the choice and control is with the person, not defaulting to kind of deficit-based needs and risks and fixing mentalities, but to really hear, respond to each person in front of them. And I think through focusing on those, the strengths, the talents, the abilities, together the coach and individual respond based on that unique system that the person chooses to lead for themselves. So ultimately leading to them transitioning out of a tough time in their life. And I think through influencing, we influence through the kind of the doing on the ground. We listen to people we work with. The coaches hear systemic barriers that are exposed through working in a person-led way. And as an organisation over the past 10 years, we've had to radically transform to create the environment for these system stewards, for the coaches to work to the agenda of people. And so this has included changing, our own structures, staff teams, approaches to income generation, marketing, finance, data capture, governance, all of that, in order so that the coaches can be autonomous to work as person-led system stewards. So I think just in conclusion, for us as a provider, we see system stewardship absolutely happening at the grassroots. We see the need to kind of transform organisations, create the right culture, so that actually all actors within it end up becoming kind of stewards of a learning environment. So that conditions, the culture enable this to happen for people. And we aim to attract others to change as part of the kind of wider systems change agenda. So it becomes a person-led system and not a contract or system-led one.
Thanks, Lanya. So that different ways of working is really important, and not only transforming ourselves, but transforming the systems that we're working in. I'd like to go to Kim now. And Kim, in earlier conversations, we've talked a lot. You've talked about the architecture and enablers. So, what does system stewardship mean to you from your perspective?
Great, thanks, Sally. And lots of similar themes in my perspective, and I am going to talk from the perspective of 25 years in government. And whilst I was in government throughout my career, I've been really heavily influenced by Amartya Sen, and that the role of government is to empower people to build capabilities so they have more choices and the ability to lead a life they have reason to value. But also Peter Singh and a lot of his work and thinking about the operation of systems, with systems thinking, for me, always needing to be grounded in kindness, in curiosity and in continuous improvement. So when I combine those two frameworks, I've always thought about government's role as a system steward as being responsible for the care for and of the long-term quality, sustainability and outcomes of a service system. And government exercises its stewardship role by establishing that architecture, the relationships and the enabling conditions so that all of the actors in the system, the providers, the practitioners, the families, the individuals using the services, all of them are in a position to continuously learn, adapt and achieve shared outcomes together. And that government isn't simply a purchaser provider, that they are actively helping to create the value that people are looking for from that system through supporting the generation and adoption of evidence, but also by empowering people to be partners in the services that they deliver and consume. And the last thing I'd say is that because it is all about people, stewardship is all about people, it's very rare that one service system is going to be able to create that capability to be able to equip people to lead a life they have reason to value. So part of government stewardship role is also to act at the interface between systems to remove barriers and make it as easy as possible for people or actors from multiple systems to work together.
Very good. Yes, the notion of different systems and how they interrelate is really important. So let's go to Toby now, back to the other side of the world. And Toby, you've done a lot of work on human learning systems and this concept of system stewardship as a new way of, a new form of public management, if you like, so a new way of working. So what does system stewardship mean to you?
Thank you, Sally. Let me start by kind of offering what I understand by a system. And so a system is just a set of relationships that combine to make things happen in the world, right? So, and these systems are made up of actors, people and organizations, and factors, causal or structural relationships. So, and a system is only definable as a system which does something. So something that, these set of relationships that has a particular purpose. So when we talk about any given system, what we're doing is making a choice about how we frame the world. What are we saying is important about the things that create and enable a particular purpose? So I think from a public management perspective, when we talk about systems, let's start by talking about systems from the perspective of the people being served. So what are the actors and factors that combine to create an outcome in each person's life? So, and these are all different. So, for example, the actors and factors that combine to create well-being in my life are different from the actors and factors that combine to create well-being in each of your lives. And so what we've learned is that the task of helping people create outcomes in their lives can be thought of as system stewardship. So how can those different actors and factors combine to make good things happen? And so asking that question makes it clear that the task of system stewardship for us is about managing and governing action learning process. Because the task of enabling different people and organisations to come together to help people achieve outcomes in their lives is a process of continuous experimentation and learning. And a final thing that, as we've seen from the people so far, system stewardship happens at different system scales. So it exists in the work of those who serve the public directly. Exists at an organisational level, at a local place level, at a state level, and at a country level. And system stewardship at each of those levels is the process of supporting a set of actors to learn together to enable those learning relationships on the ground. So for me, system stewardship is stewarding the actors that create outcomes to learn together. That's how real outcomes are made.
Nice summary, and you've all kept completely the time, which is really impressive. So we're going to go to a Zoom poll now, and you, the audience, can start thinking about what you want to hear from our panelists next. So we've got 3 questions, and so here they are. I'll read them out, and you can vote on these. So what is the one question you would most like to see put to the panel? You only have one choice, though, I'm sorry. So the first one is, can you give some examples of government embracing innovative approaches to system stewardship? The second one is, what do you see as being the main barriers to system stewardship within and between systems? And the third potential question is, what are the main capabilities that enable system stewardship within and between systems? A lot of toing and froing here. Where are we up to? It's like even Stevens between 1 and 3 at this point. I know.
It's very exciting.
It is. So this is we're finished. Okay, so I think it's question number 1. So you're going to have to give some examples now. So I've turned my page now. So the question is, can you give some examples of governments embracing innovative approaches to system stewardship? Can we start with you this time, Kim?
Yeah, sure. So, look, I think I might use health as an example where there has been a huge shift in the last few years to move from thinking about the efficient flow of patients through a hospital, for example, into thinking much more about the experience that patients care most about in their healthcare and the outcomes they want from healthcare. And there's a really exciting movement around patient-reported outcome measurement as being a way into changing models of care, shifting care out into the community, using technology differently to empower people to be more active participants in their own care, but also to have better planning at a local level about what is really driving the determinants of health outcomes, the social determinants in particular of healthcare and health outcomes, and having very different players, to Toby's point, working together, learning together, who in the past would not have seen themselves as being contributing to the same purpose, but increasingly are understanding that if you are going to think about the whole person and their life and their health and well-being, that there are many factors that impact on that need to be brought together from the person's perspective.
Great. Lynn, have you got some examples of where you've seen government doing this well, the interface that you have with government?
Yes, I'm actually going to give an example at a local government level. And this is something, it kind of nods a bit to what Toby was talking about earlier about kind of experiments in this space. And I think we worked with a network of organisations to model person-led work. We did that for a good few years to see what it looked like in all the different areas. And I think one of the barriers to person-led work and to the system being person-led was funding and commissioning. So one of the things that Mayday Trust is experimenting with at the moment is something that we call a transitions pilot. And this is working with local authority commissioners from different silos to come together to really work together and learn together. We bring in the PTS coaches into the locality, and we come together every month to learn and reflect on the work and the realities on the ground. So what's happening when we pass power and control to people? What does that look like? What are the system barriers that we experience, that we see in real time? And working with those commissioners to kind of, like I said, to learn together, to start to build what does or what could person-led commissioning mean? And I think because when we look at commissioning, we look at funding, it's not about just changing kind of words and specifications. It's not about kind of rejigging what we've got. It's about, can we completely reimagine and remodel what it looks like to commission and work and fund in a person-led way. So we're doing that at the moment with a council in London in England called Haringey Council. We've been doing that for a couple of years, and it's just been a really interesting experiment to start to bring together all of those actors. So we're all kind of system stewards in that space around how can we start to really look at of the realities of a person-led system. And so that's been a really interesting piece of work.
Cool. And it's those relationships that are really important too, isn't it? That we're forming new kinds of partnerships. Toby, I'll go to you now. Have you got some, from all your research, have you got some really good examples of where you've seen this in practice?
Yeah, I'll give a couple of examples from different scales of government. So echoing what Lynn was saying, at local government scale, Plymouth, the Plymouth Alliance, which is an alliance of the local council, local NHS actors, and local voluntary sector organisations. The commissioning of that work, it's kind of work to support people who've experienced homelessness, substance abuse problems, mental health problems, those kind of things. And they've created an £80 million 10-year public commission to support people in that space. And the commissioners have completely redefined what it means to do commissioning. So it's £80 million 10-year contract. There's no targets, no KPIs, none of that. They commission those organisations to learn together effectively. So the governance of all of that resource, the public accountability, is about enabling organisations to learn together effectively, because they realise that that's how good outcomes are created. So they commission for outcomes by commissioning organisations to learn together effectively. So what they're doing is acting as system stewards for the set of organisations, create it by commissioning for learning. They create an environment where all of those organisations can work together well. And then second example would be the Finnish National Education Agency, where they've taken their role as not as trying to control what happens at a local level in the education system, but the National Education Agency instead act as enablers for local learning and experimentation. So what they do is they create a program where they bring together actors at a local level, help them to identify what the kind of child welfare and pedagogy questions are that they want to solve at a local place, and provide kind of learning system support. How do you design good experiments? How do you run good experiments? How do you capture data? How do you reflect together as people? And so the national agency acts as a learning partner effectively to local systems, to enable those local systems to function as learning systems more effectively.
That's interesting to hear an example from a country that we're not so familiar with too, in Finland. And Finland doesn't even have a national curriculum, does it? But it's got a very strong professional teacher base, which is really interesting.
It does have a national curriculum, but the national curriculum was co-designed by all the local actors.
Yeah. Lil, let's go to you, because I'm sure there are lots of examples in Aotearoa New Zealand that we can talk about here.
I'm really glad to say there are. You know, probably 10 years ago, Sally, I probably wouldn't have had many to draw on, but I think if we use Toby's definition of system, then my system is the Māori Crown relationship. So it's the relationship between our Indigenous people and our government and its agencies. And I take that as the guardian of that, particularly within the public service. We've had to make a real point of mandating the role. So our Public Services Commissioner has very publicly mandated me as the system leader. One of the most innovative things we've done is recognising that to change the nature of that relationship, we have to change the nature of the way the public service works. So how do you change the way 60,000 people have done their job for over 100 years? Was the real challenge. And what we decided was that it starts with leadership. So 36 chief executives, every chief executive in our public service has signed up to change the way they work with our Indigenous people in two key ways over the next 12 months. They have then signed up their entire agency to those two same qualities or competencies, and they will report against their progress in their annual report. I think that type of accountability from a public service in its entirety is probably one of the first in the world, particularly in regard to Indigenous relations. It has been mandated through Cabinet. All ministers are supporting their chief executives to achieve that. And we've also agreed a set of measures that will tell us what it looks like when we're getting better and how we might get to whatever the next stage is of us being better. It recognises that not everyone starts from the same starting place. And I think there are a set of health indicators, we call them, that will show us the overall impact of us lifting our capability on that Māori Crown relationship system that I am the guardian of within the public service. I think we're really lucky, and I always keep in mind that this isn't for the sake of the system. This is for the sake of making sure that we can change the way the Indigenous people in New Zealand live and enjoy their lives here, because at the moment a lot of our statistics are very similar to those around the world. So I saw a question just pop up, and I think the two sort of areas that all agencies and all chief executives have agreed to learn is the language. So not becoming expert speakers of Te Reo Māori, but using enough of it to connect with Indigenous people, because it builds trust and it builds relationships. The second is to learn about the history of our country and the treaty. I think being able to have every chief executive and every public servant on that journey is just huge. So hopefully that gives you a feel for how we are thinking about changing an entire system.
And it's true. I was out of the country for a few years and coming back, and I'm just amazed at the amount of te reo that our leaders have here. One of the questions, things that have been coming up, the themes, is this notion of trust and the different power balances, or rebalancing power. And so one of the issues we can talk about a little bit further, we're going to go into some breakout groups now, is what's the difference between stewardship and leadership, or what's the role of leadership within that stewardship relationship. So I think, if I'm right, CPI people, we're going into a breakout group now. Give me a heads up, David.
Hey Sally, just as people are leaving and listening to everyone's perspectives, maybe the other, have we left? It's all right.
No, we're here.
Yeah, just the other thing that I think it comes through as some natural polemics or tensions in how we all talk about system stewardship is the relationship between individual agency or community agency and evidence, and the relationship between standards or creating the rail guards, if you like, and creating the enabling conditions for local innovation. And I think it would be useful, kind of interesting to talk about that in the breakout rooms, that in my mind those things aren't irreconcilable. You want to build agency but provide guidance on evidence, so that people are informed in making choices and solving local problems. And in terms of determining, what are the quality safeguards, what are the clarity of purpose, so that everyone can have a conversation where they're not talking at odds with one another. That is an important part, I think, of building that trust, of building the shared understanding of what people are trying to achieve. But I wonder if we should, in addition to teasing out leadership as its relationship to stewardship, just tease out the kind of framework or architecture rules of the game versus innovation. And
I like your concept of the architecture, because that's the infrastructure that enables and supports something to happen. And in that sense, people can talk also about sort of relationships and mindsets and different accountability mechanisms, and what are the capabilities and tools for collaboration that we need to build into the way we're working. So something that's
and how do we use evidence?
And different forms of evidence too. Like what is evidence? Evidence isn't just something that happened in the past. It's people's lived experiences. Okay, so we're going to go into breakout groups now. So the team will put you into a group. This is optional, so if you don't want to be part of it, just click later rather than join group. But please join us again in 10 minutes. So in these breakout groups, what we'd like you to discuss is what about what you just heard resonated the most with you? Is there anything that you disagreed with or you'd like to add to? And what sort of changes might you make in your own practice to make real the ideas that the panel has spoken about today? So let's get into some of those really practical things. So what is that architecture? What are the change mindsets and ways of working that we need to start thinking about? Hoki mai, welcome back, and I hope you've had a good conversation there. We had a brilliant one with the panel, and I think we'll can you please put your comments and your questions now into chat so that we can put those to the panel. But we've just had a really fascinating conversation in the break, so I think I'd like the audience to hear this one. And it started with what Kim was saying just before we left about how to balance evidence and innovation, and talking about the architecture around how government works, so those sort of guardrails that she talked about, and then learning systems and adaptation. And Toby then talked about moving from evidence-based policy to evidence-informed practice, and what that means. So what does evidence mean in this kind of context? So I think, panel, can you just start talking like you were talking before and have a conversation amongst yourselves? You don't need me to facilitate it. So maybe Kim start, and then Toby jump in as well.
We were really talking about that there's always a spectrum from fidelity to a kind of fixed view of evidence through to really local context being incredibly important, and having to adapt and interpret evidence to ensure that you apply it effectively, and that really increasingly most parts of service delivery are moving more down the recognition that adaptation and interpretation is important. There will be some occasions, and we use the example of dosing for chemotherapy, where fidelity to kind of evidence is still important. But even in most parts of medicine, there's increasing recognition. We talked about surgery, that where organs are located in people's bodies is actually not exactly the same for each person, and so there is judgment, interpretation that is required. So evidence is not kind of juxtaposed with local context, but there is a deliberate assessment that needs to be thought through.
Toby, you want to jump in?
Yeah, exactly. And the point that has just been made in the chat, that when you take this view of kind of evidence-informed practice rather than evidence-based policy, what that allows you to do is also expand your understanding of what evidence is. So in almost all cases, people are experts in their own lives, and so the evidence that they have about what happens when I do this and what happens when I do this in that context becomes part of the conversation in that kind of learning relationship between the person and the public service worker who supports them. It enables all forms of experience, the types of evidence that are generated by academic research, and the types of evidence that people accumulate through living their lives. All of that becomes important in understanding what is it that we should try and do in in the context that we find ourselves in. So that shift, yeah, one of the reasons why that shift is important for me is because it enables us to expand our understanding of what.
And I think that that whole point about evidence too, and that people are experts on their own lives, and it's something we talk about a lot in Aotearoa New Zealand, is that what the Indigenous knowledge too, and how we bring that into relationship between the state and Māori. Would you like to comment on that, Lil?
I just think those words have been so important in our journey in Aotearoa. You know, evidence tells us that the data-based policy that we have been writing for years lacked that real person touch, and the innovation that we have come across, which is actually we need to go out and engage with people. You know, I continue to say to public servants, if you've never been poor, how do you write policy on lifting people out of poverty? If you've never had to wonder how to buy a bread from the shop and you couldn't afford it, how would you know how to fix that? And so this idea of engagement isn't just about making relationships good. It's about getting a different kind of evidence from real people who are experiencing hardships or opportunities. That is the thing, I think, that leads you to innovation, because data continues to point you to the same answers that we've had for 20, 40, 50 years, and they're obviously not working. So I do think those two words have been really important in our journey, and the evidence pointed us to, actually, if we don't innovate, things are not going to change. And you can only innovate the system if the people within it are willing to be different. And so that ties into the system stewardship for me. So really important conversation.
And that whole notion that anything that's new and innovative, by definition, there's no looking back evidence. We're creating something new. So that then goes into this whole trust model. And we had a question, I think it's from my friend Guy Beatson, who's always a good contributor in these kind of sessions. But as when our standard model of government has been very much that command and control, how do we shift those mindsets? You know, you're working with chief executives in New Zealand and departments to get them to have different mindsets and work in different ways. But, you know, we've got pretty fixed ways of doing things in our old public management models here in New Zealand, and I'm sure around the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. COVID's been really helpful, I think, Sally. You know, no one probably says that out loud. I only say it in the positive way that it has broken down silos. It has showed us what our communities are really capable of. And a lot of those communities are Indigenous led. And so what we see is their ability to be resilient, their ability to be ahead of us. And those are the things that teach us as government leaders that we actually can devolve power and decision making because they're doing it anyway. So I think there are some really important lessons that have come out of that for us.
And it's that sort of trust. Lynn, would you like to comment on that as well? How do we build trust in our communities so that we can, you know, come together as a system to meet outcomes, to meet some shared goals?
So I might quickly touch upon what we were talking about previously around the evidence-informed practice and what that looks like when we're talking about innovation, because one of the things that we did at Mayday Trust was to basically start from scratch and take a blank piece of paper to everything. And we took a very different view on how we would kind of look at innovation and started to have a mindset more around prototyping. And I think what we did was passing that kind of when we said about the power and control to people, and we were kind of getting out of the way, but just listening and learning and hearing what was happening in people's lives, and then using that as a measure as to how we would need to change ourselves. So I think when you said previously about, you know, it's not about looking back, actually a lot of ours was looking back in the sense of we made sense of things in retrospect rather than looking at what we thought it should look like and to see if we'd prove ourselves right. And it was being able to have that kind of have that learning environment, the permission, you know, almost to just kind of say, well, let's just see what's emerging. Let's see what's learning. What does evidence look like for each person? And I think what we found is that it's absolutely unique to every single individual. So it's really interesting when we're looking at kind of evidence, people that have been stuck in very deficit-based systems for a long period of time have often built up a lot of failures in their lives that they've perceived as their own. And actually, when you start to work with someone in a person-led way, they can see for themselves and they can evidence for themselves that they can achieve. And I don't think I've seen the same thing for two people, that it's been completely unique. So your question around building trust, that's absolutely fundamental for our coaches working with people, is being able to create an environment where people can be in control and build trust. And that's absolutely fundamental to this type of working. So when our coaches meet people, they know their name and phone number. They know nothing about somebody's previous history. They come with no preconceptions. They meet people where they want to meet in communities, and it's genuinely led by that person. And I think once you start having a relationship with somebody that has a very different power dynamic, where the power sits with the person and it's up to them what they bring, can take a while to kind of build that. But without that trust within that unique relationship, nothing else will work unless that can happen. So we always say that, you know, we don't co-produce services. It's very much there's a co-produced interaction between the worker and the person themselves, and that trust there has to be absolutely integral to that relationship working.
So talking about these sort of capabilities and tools and ways of working, and you use the word co-producing. So what are some of these ways of working that we can build in? Like what you were talking about, Lynn, sounded a lot like, you know, sort of more of a design process and a co-design process and a co-producing things, which is the antithesis of command and control. And please, the rest of the panel, just jump in.
The co-production is just in that unique relationship. So what we don't do is co-produce programs or projects or anything at all. And I think, you know, that collaboration happens between the coach and the individual. We're not talking about collaborating with all of the other services or how do we make the system more efficient. What we're talking about is how do we change the system behind people being able to lead themselves. And it's a very different mindset. And I think we talk about this as more of a paradigm shift rather than a kind of systems change, system tweak. It's modeling something completely different and being able to attract people to that based on what we learn and what we hear. So it is a very different kind of nuance, I guess, as to when we talk about systems change, co-production, all of that. And I think that's why prototyping kind of seemed to fit our narrative a bit more, because it was absolutely getting rid of any preconceptions and just completely learning from what we heard and responding accordingly.
And being much more experimental. So some of the Lil and Kim, like working in government, how can we use some of those ways of working more in government as well? And Toby, jump in.
I think I think Lynn's hit on something really important there, which is you first have to believe that working that way is going to make a difference. You first have to believe that working that way is worth the risk of co-design, because co-design does come with risk. Co-design comes with the risk of expectations being too high, of what people might think of you partnering with that particular group of people. On the outcomes being too different, on the resourcing being too great. So you've got to be able to understand those are risks, but still think it's important to do it. And I think in the pace at which we work in government, sometimes we don't take the time to think of how much better would it be if we co-designed, rather than, oh, it's really going to take too long and I'm not really sure about the risk that I want to take with it. And so, you know, what we have learned is there's got to be a better way, and there is a bit more mandate, I think, at the moment to try different things to get us to a different place.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we've talked about that it might take longer up front, but it actually is faster at the other end, and you don't have a lot more rework or getting things wrong. Somebody
1,000 cups of tea, Sally, that's what I say. It takes 1,000 cups of tea.
Yeah. Well, breaking bread, isn't it? I mean, it's about how we build relationships. I remember having to bake cakes to get people to come to a meeting, and when I was working in the public service in Wellington. Somebody asked earlier in the chat, is system stewardship harder when the purpose of the system is unclear? Does anyone have comments on that? And I think it was in relation to the sometimes we do have different outcomes in mind.
So can I'll comment on that. One of the problems that we have as in terms of identifying the purpose for public service is that we've tried to identify the purpose of public service from the centre. Right? If we take the idea of outcome seriously, it should be, and we take the idea of human freedom and flourishing seriously, essentially only the people themselves have the right to say, this is what a good outcome looks like for me. No one else has the right to say that. So what are we doing trying to define that, for example, in the purpose of the question, what is the purpose of an employment system? Why are we trying to define that centrally, right? Isn't it in the relationship between the person and the unemployed person and the person trying to help them? They know what the purpose of that should be in respect of that person's life. Right? Flipping kind of public service so that it is about supporting human freedom and flourishing, and the human freedom and flourishing of each and every person, doesn't take all of that question away, but it takes an awful lot of that question away. And what are we doing in public service if it's not about supporting human freedom and flourishing?
Just to be a little bit of a heretic against the flow of the conversation, which I don't disagree with at all, but I also think that there are lots of types of services where some critical mass matters, and there's a question in the chat about public transport systems, for example, where they aren't designed kind of for individual travel. They're designed to enable a kind of collective ability for movement around, to get to work, to get to services, to have a quality of life. And the same would go for capitally intensive services. So now personally, I think in aged care that we should be moving much more to reflect a bit more in line with Toby's views, the individual preferences for independent living to be supported. But even if you're talking about independent living being supported, you do need to be able to, in rationed resources, to be able to have models of care that can benefit as many people as possible. So inevitably you need to build a bridge from experimentation and very individualised responses into models of service that can help as many people as possible, equip them as many people as possible to lead a life they've reason to value. And it's in that exchange, in that space between very individualised responses and efficient ways of designing services that inevitably there is going to be a role for government in taking all of the evidence, sharing it, designing incentive models that enable that to be spread, and ensuring that there are a sharing of benefits across the population as a whole.
And that's the whole question of new models at scale. Is how do we get the scale? Toby, you look like you want to say something.
There. Yeah, so and Kim's exactly right in that government does exactly have a role in kind of balancing resources across all different things, and the kind of finite resources point is really important. But one thing I do think we get wrong is the equating models and standardization with efficiency, because it is only efficient from the perspective of the provider to turn those things into kind of industrial standardized processes. From the perspective of creating outcomes, and if we say that the business of government is helping create outcomes, it is not efficient at all. The most efficient way of creating outcomes it provides is bespoke, because it eliminates waste, it eliminates inefficiencies in providing services that aren't actually useful to people. So I would really, really challenge the idea that standardization creates efficiency. When you look at it from the perspective of people's lives, standardization creates inefficiency and waste. It is bespoke support that is the most efficient way to create outcomes.
So Toby, in your mind, a public transport system, how is that able to be made bespoke?
Yeah, now that, see, I don't feel equipped to talk about public transport stuff, so it might well be different there, because we haven't done work in public transport stuff, so that might be a different case. I would be speaking outside my field of competence.
That sort of gets up to, there's a great question from Fiona May talking about and it gets into what are the barriers to system stewardship as well, and a lot of them are the kind of accountability mechanisms and the way we do budgets that force us into these vertical silos. So how do we get past that? How do we become more enabling and overcome those kind of barriers, which are there for very good reasons of accountability?
I mean, I've got two answers to that question. The first is I do think accountability should be reconceptualised. I put it in the chat as being about enabling learning rather than the stalking house for fault finding was, I think, the way I described it. And when you reimagine accountability to be about learning systems, even if there are different pools of funding, you can connect them up in creative ways. So I think that's part of the art. And my second answer is very much about thinking about place and cohort. Again, enables you to think more creatively and flexibly about what are the combination of resources that are going to make a difference.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I actually wouldn't put budget as the first barrier. I would put us, people, are often the first barrier in my experience. And that comes from a few places. I think firstly it comes from fear. fear of the unknown. I think it comes from the control we have always had on things and the fear of letting that go. I think, as I said, it's about risk. I think when it comes to budget, some of the things we have done is created specific funding for the purposes of system redesign, for the purposes of co-design, to recognise that our Indigenous partner, to even up the power imbalance, I think is the way Kim described it. You have to recognise that your partner doesn't have the same level of resources, doesn't have 60,000 people to call on. And so the ability, I think, to balance that up is recognised through our ability to fund them to be our partners sometimes. We have found agencies, we've pulled together money, I think as you've talked about specifically, for the purpose of overcoming some of these barriers. There are specific budget bids that go into our government process that are for the purposes of partnering within our systems. And I think we're doing that more and more. Maybe 10 years ago, you would have seen 3 or 4 joined up bids for that purpose. And now you're seeing 8 or 9 or 10.
Yeah, I just remember it was so difficult to get, funding, for example, for the co-design lab in Auckland. That was a tiny amount of money. But now we've built some sort of mechanisms into the Public Service Act on things like joint ventures to enable and encourage collaboration. But they can be a little bit clunky too sometimes. But
yeah, they can be quite clunky, I think, Sally. And, what I'm seeing, though, is Māori are feeling like they are actually being invited in to be a partner within the public service. If we use those joint venture boards, the ability of iwi to leverage their own financial capability alongside government is pretty phenomenal in terms of what we can achieve together.
So what about this question of that somebody raised earlier about the difference between, so what's the role of a leader and stewarding? Because stewarding, and its most definition is sort of curating and bringing people together, and yet our concept of a leader is someone who's decisive and going to make decisions like that without having to talk to any. So how do we change those mindsets of leaders in the public service?
It's really funny. I saw that question, and I'm not sure. I think they are different. I don't think they are very different, particularly not in the role I'm playing as a system steward. It's just instead of 200 staff, I've got 60,000 people that I have to help. And I think, I'm a leader, I am a steward of a system, I'm a leader, I'm a steward of my organisation. I think all that changes is scope. I'm lucky that my job, everyday job, aligns with my system steward role. Both fulfil the same purpose, so they're mutually accountable to each other. So I do think that they require the same qualities of a person. I think the stewardship role requires you to know your system, though. We have 36 agencies. I've had to understand what each does, how deep into each community it goes. And that's a lot of system to understand and comprehend. And so I think the ability to know your system better than anyone is probably the extra part of stewarding. You have to know it better than everybody, and not just the government side. You have to know the other, in my case, I have to know the Māori communities better than anyone. That's built into my role.
And it's not just a leader, but all of us operating in a system. What are the kind of new capabilities that public servants have to have, and in order to build relationships with people outside? So it's no longer, like, for example, policy is no longer a desk-based activity. We need to get out and talk to people, but how do we build those kind of capabilities? Is it just practice, or have people got some examples of some, particular kind of learning systems? I see Toby's getting excited at the notion of learning systems.
This was one of the challenges that the Finnish folk came up against when they were doing their work, in that when they were kind of creating this program whereby the role of the national agency was to support learning at a local level. One of the challenges they encountered was that national civil servants who had been employed in expertise roles would show up in the local inquiries that were being held and say, I know the answer. It's all right. We can stop your local experimentation. Now we know what to do here. And so what they did was created a mentoring system that enabled those kind of people with particular expertise to show up in those inquiries with curiosity. So I would say that curiosity becomes a key capability for kind of public service in this context, and that means being able. One thing is relearning how to deploy expertise in that evidence-informed practice type way, rather than the I know what to do here type way. It's all right, everyone else can stop. And so that, the way they created that was through a mentoring program. So they actually created a mentoring program for civil servants to enable people to develop and allow their curiosity to have greater reign, rather than trying to show up and say, we know the answer.
The other, very related, but the other perspective I would bring is I think kindness and empathy are incredibly important as well. And, I've always thought if you anchor an improvement, continuous learning focus in the values of an organisation, and every organisation I've ever worked in has been very values-based, then you don't come up against the kind of change fatigue curse that cruels those kind of conversations that we're having, because actually the curiosity and empathy makes those conversations and experimentation and new solutions exhilarating and energizing, rather than experienced as another change.
I'd say in our organisation, it's making sure that learning, that the prototyping, what we hear is it's kind of part of the culture of the whole organisation. It runs through the fabric of everybody within it. And I think we're very specific when we're recruiting into our organisation, that people are recruited on the basis that they are willing to be challenged, to learn, adapt, change, because our organisation didn't come about to do this work, it evolved. And we did 30 years of very traditional, probably quite deficit-based work. So we've had to transform the organisation to get to this point, not just start it from scratch. And I think one of the most important things for me is around that, like Kim was saying, you have to build this stuff into your vision, your mission, your values, your strategic direction, that learning is part of your governance. But I think it sounds very easy, and I would say that it can be quite difficult to absolutely live by these values, and you have to make very tough decisions around, types of contracts that you take, giving back funding that doesn't work for you. We've completely reinvented our organisation probably about 3 times. So huge restructures. We've gone from staff teams of 80 to 40 to 20. Our turnover has shrunk, but we work with other people in partnership, having a very different view of what traditional organisations look like and feel like. And we say sometimes it's around unprofessionalising. You have to unlearn, rather than just learn systems, learn what these things are. Often you have to really unlearn what you think of or thought of as professional best practice in order to be able to learn and work in this way. So I'd say it's a very personal journey as well as a professional one, actually. And having the right people around you is incredibly important.
Hey, just on Luke's question about should we expect a steward to know the system better than everyone, or does that reinforce existing power structures? I guess I would reframe the question, Luke, to say that it's really important that there are a range of leaders, but including government actors, who are keeping an eye out that there aren't being people that are being falling through the cracks, excluded from the conversations, the relationships. And so it is important that there's an expectation that that leaders singly and collectively understand both intrinsic motivations and who all the key actors should be. I don't see that as being paradoxical to sharing of power.
I just wanted to pick that up as well, Kim, because one of the reasons as a system steward you want to understand your system is you need to help people navigate it. And I find lots of shortcuts is what I find. If I know my system, I know the way to get things done. I'm very action oriented, and I struggle to sit around and talk for very long before I need to do something. And so, see, right now I have this need to stand up and draw on a whiteboard. But I think what we are finding is we can navigate through our system of government to help the Māori Crown relationship much faster because we understand it.
So we're just about running out of time, but I think we've talked about reframing what's an expert, we've talked about reframing what's evidence, we've talked about the kind of mindsets that we need to build in, to be curious, to be empathetic, to be open, to be experimental, and to be really good at building relationships and trust, which really does look like a different system than what we're coming from. So we can have hope that we're reimagining government in this series of webinars, and maybe we'll start to reinvent it. So I just want to say a big thank you to our wonderful panelists. I could just about feel all that knowledge oozing out of the screen. Thank you so much to the audience for coming. This has been our final Reimagining Government webinar for 2021. We've really enjoyed all your comments, questions and feedback that's made the whole series so interactive. We're going to be circulating a survey after this webinar, which will arrive in your inbox shortly. And on behalf of ANZOG, I'd really love to thank our colleagues at the Centre for Public Impact for this collaboration over the last 2 years, and we're hoping to do the same thing next year. But we want to hear from you. So what do you want to hear about, and what kind of webinar topics would you like for us next year? In the coming weeks, they'll be sending out a longer survey to get your thoughts about what you might like next year. So tell us what you want to hear. And also, there's also this Reimagining government website that you can please dig into. There's lots of really good resources in there. And we want to foster this community of practice about reimagining government. So join up to that community of practice, and there'll be new interactive sessions, conversations, and networking opportunities. Thank you very much, everybody. This has been a great session, and thank you from me, and good night, have a good day wherever you are.